We're getting ready for more 1500 Suburban fun. The transmission is shifting pretty good, but it's a little twitchy on the overdrive gear a little bit. It has a spot about 45 miles an hour, just doesn't like to drive. I can kind of drive through it, but it's kind of annoying me. So when I got the truck, I don't really have any records since it's a used vehicle. When the transmission fluid was changed, if it was changed at all, it's 114,000 miles. So let's do a fluid change and filter change on the transmission. Anyway, it's a good time to do it. And who knows, it might actually behave a little bit better through its shifting pattern, or not be quite so fussy, at least not on the overdrive gear. Once you're safely up on jack stands, then you can go ahead and crawl under, and you're going to have to remove a bolt. This cross member here, all the way across, there's a bolt that threads right onto there. That's what keeps the, see if I can get back far enough to see the transmission pan. The transmission is bolted, so you have to remove that bolt from the cross member, and then we're going to use a jack. I'll get a wooden block up on top of the jack. In between, the wooden block goes in between the jack and this transmission pan here. We'll actually raise the transmission up. It's a little creepy to do, but go ahead and you're going to actually jack the transmission up now that we have that bolt removed. And once it's up high enough, you'll put a block of wood on top of this cross member and under that the threaded section there to keep the whole transmission raised up. And the whole purpose of doing that is so that you can get on the pan bolts that are hidden behind this cross member. There's no way to swap out the fluids unless you can get every single bolt all the way removed. If you go through some of your repair manuals, they'll let you know you can. On this one here, I'll probably keep those back bolts a little bit loose. Remove these side ones, and then slowly remove these front ones. Tip the whole pan forward and let as much transmission fluid as I can drain into the pan, and then try to remove the last bolts at the back. Try to keep this from being such a sloppy job. If you have a truck that has a proper transmission fluid already, it's important to capture all that fluid in a pan so that you can measure it out later and know exactly how much fluid to put back into your transmission. It's much harder to fill the transmission and get your levels right when you don't know where you're starting from. So you can keep track of that transmission fluid when you drain it out, measure it, and then put exactly that much back in after your job is done, and you'll be pretty darn close to right where you were before. So as you can see, I've got this was just a piece of 4x4, a nice long piece of 2x2 that goes all the way across from one side of the transmission pan to the other. And way back in there, if you can see it, I've got another piece of 2x2 lumber that was just high enough to go underneath the transmission there. So when I drop the jack here, this will stay raised up high enough that you have access to those bolts in the back. It's hard to get oriented, but here's that. I'm at the back of the transmission, and right here is the wooden block that I put in. There's on this pan one bolt that's very difficult to get into the back, but I could probably go ahead and raise up the transmission a little higher and have an easier time to get to it. But just want to let you know that I'm actually starting in the rear and working on these harder to get back bolts and trying to Don't get angry, just kind of be patient, you'll get through it. This will be hard to show, but maybe if I can get a light on it. I don't know if you can see. I'll keep trying here. A little too close. Okay. That's the bolt that was down through that cross member, and there's quite a bit of shimming that has to go up to get that bolt to rest high up enough, meaning you've jacked the transmission up high enough to be able to get the pan out. It was way too greasy and way too nasty underneath here with the camcorder to show it, but I had a devil of a time getting the transmission up high enough so that I could then drop the pan down this low and get it out. I kept trying to catch up in here because there's no way around it. You have to jack the transmission up pretty high. So anyway, that took a lot of wrangling. It wasn't very pretty for the way all the fluid was slopping around. I won't be able to videotape it all, but I'll go through here with a putty knife and everywhere along here, make sure this gasket surface is all clean and scraped down and ready to go. And that way, hopefully we won't have any leaks whenever we put the new transmission filter and pan with the gasket back up. This is a little out of sequence for you guys, but after I dropped the pan, I had pulled down the actual transmission filter, the old one, which just slips up inside here by purely by compression, by just the force of it being popped up into a washer that's up inside of there. I've taken out the old washer. I'm going to call it a washer. It's more like an O-ring. It's more like a seal. And see how it's bent and deformed in. That's because to get the old one out, which is usually in there very tough, you have to put a screwdriver in through the side and kind of knock it up in to get break that seal, twist your screwdriver, bend it in, and then you can get this thing out. I'll show you with the new. This is a new filter that I have, and with every new transmission filter you get a new one of these washer, O-ring, seals, whatever you want to call it. It has to get put back up into the transmission. To seat it up inside there, this is going to be hard to show down from here, but I like to take something like another socket, anything that's about the same size, like a perfect match or a little smaller, that you can use to kind of hammer that new seal up into the hole where your transmission filter is going to go. And it has to be up in there tight, and it has to go in all the way. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to get the old ones out when you literally have to take a let's see if I still have it down here. See if I can get the lighting for you. This is such a mess because it's still drippy. I hope I don't drip on the camera. So, yeah, up in there is where it was, and you just take your little bitty screwdriver, and you have to take your screwdriver here and knock it. I didn't use a hammer, I just used my hand, but it's very difficult to find the lip to even start with a screwdriver, but just keep tapping away, use your hand and hit the back of the screwdriver and kind of hammer that screwdriver tip up and in there. Once it gets started, you can give it a little twist and then get a bigger screwdriver up in there and do a twist again, and it'll usually bend that out, deform it enough that it'll come out. But you have to get the new one in, and you have to seat that up in there, and usually you have to tap it in with something. Well, I use a a socket that I just showed a second ago and a hammer just to get it up in there. Once the new seal's in there, putting the new transmission filters in a piece of cake. And now we have the new one hammered with that socket back up inside there. It's a very tight fit, so you really do have to hammer it up in there. I don't know if anyone has a better technique. I'd love to see. There's probably someone who has a way smarter way of getting it up there. I'd love to hear from someone who knows how to do that. You only have to do them about every 100,000 miles, but anything to make it easier, because I did fight with it a little bit. It doesn't want to go in very easy. It dropped several times out. I almost got it bent out of shape a little bit. Had to kind of tap it back into shape again, but with a good press up in there and then that socket, I was able to hammer it up in. Let's see here. New transmission filter. Shadows are going to be in the way, but all you got to do is basically get it up into the hole there, and with a little bit of force, and get it pressed up and twisted in. And it's kind of hard for me to hold the camera and do this at the same time, so I'm going to quit videotaping and get that guy in. Give it a few good baps with your hand once you got it in place, and make sure it's up in there good and tight. Alright, new transmission filter is in. Bopped it pretty good with my hand to get it popped up and make sure it's lined up, you know, along the line right here, so that you didn't get over that. And now we move on to getting the pan back up. I've already got the I cleaned this pan out entirely. I mean, it was absolutely spotlessly clean. When you're done there, you might as well make sure there aren't any gritties, and then I putty knife the metal surface underneath where this gasket is touching. Got that completely as clean as what I could. I like to use a putty knife and not use a screwdriver so much, because the screwdriver tip tends to scrape pretty hard. The putty knife, which is wider, kind of floats along the whole thing, doesn't gouge up the metal. I've had good luck with just laying out the gasket first and popping up your bolts up through the gasket. That way it holds them all in place for you, so that you aren't futzing with them so much when you're trying to get this pan back up into the air. We'll get these all started, and then we'll get them tightened up kind of, you know, kind of sequentially going around here. You don't tighten them real tight on the first go around. You just kind of get everything snugged up and continue to go around and around. Some people would do a diagonal pattern, but I think as long as you're not trying to tighten every bolt up as tight as it'll go from the first time you get up there, you'll be all right. All right, so we got all the bolts snugged up. Same process of bracing up this pan, jacking it up with wood blocks, pulling out the shims on the other side of this cross member, and dropping this bolt back through and tightening down the nut. Hopefully we've properly tightened all of our bolts around here, and hopefully the gasket will be good for us. And one last piece I should add is, I don't know if all of them will come with or not. This is a piece of auxiliary shielding that was up here on the side of the transmission, in between the catalytic converter there, I should say, exhaust, and the transmission. I'll get that put back on there too. That was something I had taken off in between filming because it was getting in the way when I was trying to get this pan dropped. So anyway, let's go ahead and get that heat shield back on. So I wound up losing about 5.5 quarts, so I put 5.5 quarts back in. That was enough for it to drive and shift fairly well. So the problem with checking your transmission fluid levels using the dipstick here is that One, your vehicle has to be completely warmed up. The fluid should be good and hot from like a nice long drive. In park on a flat surface is how you check it. And you pull your dipstick out, wipe it just as bone dry as what you can get, put it in, and that should be, that's how you can read the dipstick. Problem is that, let's say you're low and you put a little bit of fluid in and you want to check it again. Usually that reading is terrible right after you put fluid through the tube. So you're better off just putting a little bit in, maybe a fourth of a quart at most, if you're not getting anything on the dipstick. Close it back up, drive it the next day, and check it again day after day. You can add, like I said, probably a fourth of a quart each time. Once you actually are on the dipstick and you can see like maybe you're a little low, you have to be a little cautious about how much you add. I've seen books say a tablespoon at a time. That's probably a little ridiculous. Maybe an eighth of a quart if you want to be cautious. But again, just maybe over several days, over a long period of time, just keep checking it each day, maybe after you go back and forth to work. And pretty soon you'll be up there in the correct hash marks for when it's hot. And it made a big difference, by the way, I should say, on this truck. It made a huge difference. I didn't have the problem with the overdrive being so twitchy. It shifts all the way through the gears very well. In fact, it even shifts a little sooner, definitely more solid. So it was clearly time for a fluid change. So glad that we got that done.